Have you ever held pride so tightly in your fists that it crushed everything good trying to reach your heart? Today's story ventures deep into the suffocating grip of arrogance and the devastating wake it leaves behind, but it also carries something rare and transformative, a message about the kind of forgiveness that doesn't just heal wounds, but rebuilds entire souls. What you're about to read might make you weep, might make you smile through tears, and if you let it, might change how you see every person you've ever dismissed as beneath you. The night smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Thomas Kepler gripped the steering wheel of his weathered sedan, watching the droplets of earlier drizzle slide down the windshield like tiny pilgrims searching for solid ground. 47 years of life had carved lines into his face that spoke of both sorrow and stubborn hope. And tonight, those lines deepened as he waited outside the Grandmark Hotel, a monument of glass and arrogance rising into the October sky. His taxi, a 15-year-old vehicle with cracked leather seats and a persistent rattle in the engine, looked embarrassingly out of place among the sleek town cars and limousines. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Pick up at Grandmark, VIP, possibly difficult." Thomas sighed, adjusted the small wooden cross hanging from his rearview mirror, and waited. The passenger who emerged from the hotel's golden revolving doors wore confidence like armor. He couldn't have been more than 28, dressed in a charcoal suit so precisely tailored it probably cost more than Thomas earned in 3 months. His dark hair was swept back with expensive product. His shoes gleamed even in the dim streetlight, and his phone was already pressed to his ear as he climbed into the back seat without acknowledging Thomas's existence. "Fifth and Madison," the young man barked, not as a request, but as an imperative. "And I'm late, so no scenic routes." Thomas nodded, pulling into traffic. "Yes, sir." The passenger, whose name Thomas would later learn was Damien Whitmore, continued his phone conversation with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. "I don't care what Jenkins thinks. Fire him if he can't meet the deadline. We don't pay people to make excuses. We pay them to produce results." Thomas kept his eyes on the road, navigating through the evening traffic with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing rarely got you anywhere worth going. The city lights painted moving shadows across his worn hands that had once held surgical tools before life had redirected his path in ways he'd never imagined. "This traffic is ridiculous," Damien muttered, finally ending his call. He glanced up, really seeing his driver for the first time. "Don't you people know alternate routes? Or do they just give taxi licenses to anyone with a pulse these days?" Thomas's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. "Taking the fastest route available, sir. Traffic's heavy tonight because of the convention center event." "Excuses." Damien leaned back, scrolling through his phone. "That's all I hear today. From my employees, from service people, from everyone. Nobody takes responsibility anymore." The irony of that statement, coming from someone who just ordered a man fired over a phone call, wasn't lost on Thomas, but he said nothing. Silence, he'd learned, was often the wisest response to anger looking for a target. They stopped at a red light. A homeless woman stood on the corner, her cardboard sign barely visible in the darkness. Thomas watched her for a moment, something flickering across his face that Damien caught in the rearview mirror. "Don't even think about it," Damien said sharply. "I don't have change for every sob story in this city." "Wasn't going to ask, sir." "Good. Because I'll tell you what I tell everyone. People are where they are because of the choices they make. Success doesn't happen by accident. Neither does failure." Thomas's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel, but his voice remained calm. "Sometimes life happens regardless of our choices." Damien laughed, a sound without warmth, spoken like someone who's made peace with mediocrity. "Let me guess, you've been driving this wreck for what, 20 years? Bet you tell yourself it's honest work, right? That you're doing your best." 12 years, Thomas said quietly. "And yes, it's honest work. 12 years. Damien shook his head. 12 years of going nowhere. You know what I did in 12 years? built a $40 million portfolio, became the youngest vice president in my firm's history, and bought a penthouse that costs more per month than you probably make in a year. But sure, tell yourself it's about honest work. The light turned green. Thomas accelerated smoothly, absorbing the mockery like rain on stone. He'd heard variations of this speech before, from other passengers who measured worth in dollar signs and square footage. It still stung, but the sting had grown familiar, almost expected. "You religious?" Damien asked suddenly, noticing the wooden cross swaying from the mirror. "I am." "Of course you are." Damien's laugh had an edge of contempt. "That's the problem with people like you. You accept poverty as some kind of virtue. You think suffering builds character. Meanwhile, people like me actually do something with our lives." Thomas turned onto Madison, the towers of commerce rising around them like steel giants. "And what do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" "Investment banking, mergers and acquisitions. I make more money before lunch than most people make in a month. I close deals that affect thousands of jobs, move markets, shape entire industries." There was pride in Damien's voice, the kind that had been polished to a mirror shine by years of success. "What do you do? Drive people around who actually matter." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas breathed slowly, in and out, finding the calm center he'd cultivated through years of practice. "We all have our roles to play." "Roles?" Damien leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "That's loser talk. Roles are for people who accept limitations. Winners make their own opportunities." They were approaching Fifth Avenue now, the traffic thinning slightly. Thomas could see the high-rise where Damien presumably lived, all glass and steel and expensive views. He started to change lanes when his battered leather briefcase, perched precariously on the passenger seat, slid off and hit the floor with a thud. "Can you not even keep your personal junk secured?" Damien snapped. "This is supposed to be a professional service." "Apologies, sir." Thomas kept driving, unable to reach for the briefcase without taking his eyes off the road. The case had popped open, and several items had spilled out. A few bills, some receipts, and a small, worn notebook with a leather cover that had clearly seen better days. Damien, perhaps bored with tormenting his driver verbally, reached down and picked up the notebook. "What's this?" "Your diary. Do you write down all your deep thoughts about honest work?" "That's private, sir. If you could just—" But Damien had already opened it, his eyes scanning the first page. His mocking smile began to fade almost immediately. The notebook was filled with handwriting that was careful, measured, and heartbreaking in its simplicity. The first entry was dated 7 years ago. Day 1. "They say it gets easier, but I don't believe them yet. Miriam's chair is still by the window. Can't bring myself to move it. The house is too quiet. Prayed this morning, but the words felt hollow. Need to find work. Money running out faster than I expected. Medical bills are crushing. But she's at peace now, and that has to be enough." Damien flipped to another page, his expression shifting from mockery to something more complex. Day 47. "Sold the house today. Couldn't afford it anymore. Everything we built together gone. The buyer didn't even want our furniture, said it was outdated, threw away 30 years of memories, slept in the car, prayed for strength. Not sure anyone's listening, but I keep trying." Another page. Day 90. "Started driving taxi today. Had to sell my medical license and instruments to pay the last of Miriam's bills. Couldn't practice anymore anyway, not with my hands shaking like they do. The supervisor looked at me like I was pathetic. Maybe I am. But it's work, and work has dignity, even if the world doesn't see it that way. Saw 3 passengers today. One left a $5 tip. Small mercies." Damien's breathing had changed, becoming shallower. He turned more pages, unable to stop himself. Day 203. "Woman in the back seat today reminded me of Miriam. Same laugh. Had to pull over after dropping her off. Cried for 20 minutes. Got a complaint from the next passenger about being late. Sometimes the grief ambushes you when you think you're doing okay. Prayed the tears would stop. They did, eventually. They always do. There was more. Page after page of quiet suffering, of faith tested and battered, but somehow still standing. Thomas's entire life, stripped down to its essential moments of pain and perseverance, was laid bare in that small notebook. Day 3, 170. Man today told me I was a failure. He was probably right by the world's standards. But I helped Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries to her door. She's 83 and alone. She cried and said no one had been kind to her in months. Maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's just a different kind of success. Damien reached the most recent entries, and his hands started to tremble slightly. Day 2500. 12 years now. 12 years of watching the world change, of picking up passengers who look through me like I'm invisible. Sometimes I wonder what my medical colleagues would think if they saw me now. Would they understand that I lost everything trying to save her, that I'd lose it all again if it meant one more day with Miriam? Tonight a young man got in my taxi. Suit probably cost $3,000. I could see the contempt in his eyes before he even spoke. I prayed that wherever his journey takes him, he learns compassion before life has to teach it the hard way. The entry was from tonight, from an hour ago. Damien looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes in the rearview mirror. The older man's face was illuminated by the passing streetlights, and for the first time, Damien really saw him. Saw the deep lines that grief had etched. Saw the dignity that poverty hadn't erased. Saw the quiet strength that mockery couldn't diminish. "This is about me," Damien said, his voice strange and tight. "That last entry." "Yes," Thomas said simply. They pulled up to the high-rise. The doorman, in his crisp uniform, moved to open the door, but Damien waved him off. He sat in the back seat, the notebook still in his hands, his carefully constructed armor of arrogance cracking with small, almost audible fissures. "You were a doctor," Damien said, and it wasn't a question. "Surgeon, cardiovascular." Thomas's voice held neither pride nor shame. "For 23 years. And you lost everything because my wife got cancer. Rare type, experimental treatments. Insurance didn't cover most of it. I mortgaged everything, sold everything. Kept her alive for 3 more years. Some people would say I was foolish, that I should have accepted the inevitable sooner. But you don't think that. I think love makes us do things that don't make sense on a balance sheet." Thomas turned slightly, his weathered face catching the light from the building's entrance. "I think some things matter more than money or status or what other people think success looks like." Damien felt something burning behind his eyes, something he hadn't felt in years. Shame, regret, something deeper and more uncomfortable. He looked down at the notebook again, at the careful handwriting that recorded years of suffering faced with grace. "Why do you keep driving?" Damien asked. "After everything you've been through, why keep doing this? Why subject yourself to people like—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "People like you?" Thomas completed it gently. "Because even people like you need to get where they're going, and maybe sometimes the journey matters more than we realize." The young man in the expensive suit sat in silence, and in that silence, 12 years of his own life flashed before him. The deals he'd closed, the people he'd stepped on, the relationships he'd sacrificed on the altar of ambition. His own father, dying in a hospice while Damien closed a merger in Tokyo, telling himself he'd visit next month. Next month had become too late. He thought about his father's last words, whispered to a nurse because Damien hadn't been there to hear them firsthand. "Tell my boy I loved him. Tell him success isn't what he thinks it is." Damien had dismissed those words as the confused ramblings of a dying man. But now, sitting in this broken-down taxi, holding a notebook full of genuine suffering and authentic grace, he understood what his father had been trying to tell him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? How do you apologize for being everything wrong with the world? How do you seek forgiveness from someone you'd spent the last 20 minutes treating as less than human? Thomas seemed to sense his struggle. "The fare is $23, he said quietly. Damien looked at his phone, where his banking app showed a balance that would make most people dizzy. He could give this man $1,000, 10,000, and barely notice it was gone. But throwing money at this moment felt obscene, like trying to put a price tag on enlightenment. "I don't want your money," Thomas said, reading his thoughts. "I just want you to understand something." "What?" The taxi driver turned fully now, his eyes meeting Damien's with a clarity that was almost painful to witness. "You think you're better than me because you have more. But one day, something will happen that your money can't fix, some loss that your power can't prevent, some grief that your success can't ease, and in that moment, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that the man you mocked kept choosing kindness when life gave him every reason to choose bitterness." Damien felt tears, actual tears burning in his eyes. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral, and even then it had been brief, controlled, appropriate for public consumption. But these tears were different. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere he'd walled off years ago, in pursuit of ambition. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't—" "You didn't ask," Thomas said, not unkindly. "You saw a taxi driver and you made assumptions. We all do it. The difference is what we do when we realize we were wrong." The meter showed $23. Damien pulled out his wallet, hands shaking, and removed a $100 bill. Thomas shook his head. $23. "Please," Damien's voice cracked. "Please let me—" "The fare is $23. Thomas repeated, firmer now. "I don't want your guilt money. I want you to take what you've learned tonight and become someone different. Someone who sees people, really sees them, instead of just using them as mirrors to admire yourself." Damien fumbled with smaller bills, finding exact change through tears that blurred his vision. He placed the money on the seat, then carefully, reverently, set the notebook beside it. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate, childish, too small for the enormity of his cruelty. "I'm so sorry." Thomas picked up the money and the notebook. Apology accepted. "Now go live better than you did today." Damien opened the door, stepping out into the night air that smelled of coming rain. He turned back, needing to say something more, needing to somehow bridge the gap between who he'd been 20 minutes ago and who he desperately wanted to become. "Your wife," he said. "What was her name?" "Miriam. Would she be proud of you? Of how you've lived these 12 years? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. "She would say I'm doing the best I can with what I have. That's all any of us can do." "My father died 2 years ago," Damien said suddenly. "I was in Tokyo, closing a deal. I told myself I'd visit him next month, but he died that week." The confession poured out of him like poison he'd been holding in too long. The hospice nurse said his last words were about me, that he loved me, that success wasn't what I thought it was. I dismissed it. Thought he was just confused from the medication. Thomas's expression softened. He wasn't confused. "No," Damien agreed, tears streaming freely now. "He was trying to save me from becoming exactly what I've become." "It's not too late to change," Thomas said. "It's never too late as long as you're still breathing." The doorman was watching now, confused by the sight of Mr. Whitmore crying on the sidewalk beside a beat-up taxi. Other residents were arriving, dressed for their evening engagements, their expressions shifting from curiosity to judgment as they took in the scene. Damien didn't care. For the first time in years, he genuinely didn't care what anyone thought. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. How do you forgive? How do you let go of anger and bitterness when life has taken everything from you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the weight it deserved. "You don't do it once," he finally said. "You do it every day. Every morning you wake up and choose forgiveness again. Some days it's easier than others. Some days it feels impossible. But you keep choosing it because the alternative is letting grief turn you into something you don't recognize. I don't know if I can do that." "You can. You just did, actually. Recognizing your cruelty, apologizing for it, wanting to change. That's the first step. The hard part is doing it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that, A taxi pulled up behind them, the driver honking impatiently. Thomas needed to move. "I have to go," he said, "but I'll leave you with the most important thing I've learned. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Treat them with kindness, not because they deserve it, but because you do. You deserve to be the kind of person who chooses compassion over cruelty." Damien nodded, unable to speak through his tears. He stepped back, and Thomas pulled away from the curb, the old taxi rattling off into the night with its broken but unbeaten driver behind the wheel. Standing there on the sidewalk, ignoring the stares of his wealthy neighbors, Damien experienced something he hadn't felt in years: the weight of accountability, the crushing understanding of how much harm his pride had caused, the terrifying possibility of becoming someone better. He walked into his building, past the doorman who'd known him for 3 years, but whose name he'd never learned, past the concierge at the desk who always smiled at him and whose smile he'd never returned. He rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, looking at his reflection in the polished brass walls. The man staring back at him wore a $3,000 suit and carried the weight of wasted years. His penthouse was exactly as he'd left it: perfect, expensive, and utterly empty of anything that mattered. Modern furniture that had never been sat on by friends because he didn't have friends, only contacts and connections. Art on the walls that he'd bought as investments, not because any of it moved him. Floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of a city full of people he'd never seen as fully human. Damien walked to those windows and looked down at the streets below, at the tiny figures moving through their lives. From up here, everyone looked the same: insignificant, interchangeable. But Thomas's words echoed in his mind. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. His phone buzzed with notifications: work emails, market alerts, messages from colleagues whose respect he'd earned through ruthlessness and feared through reputation. He ignored them all and did something he hadn't done since his father's funeral. He prayed. He didn't know if anyone was listening. He didn't know if he deserved to be heard after years of living like compassion was a weakness. But he prayed anyway, asking for strength to become someone his father would be proud of, someone Miriam would approve of, even though she'd never know him, someone who saw people instead of stepping on them. The rain started then, drops spattering against the windows like tears from a sky that understood repentance. Damien watched the storm roll in and felt something shift in his chest, some piece of armor he'd welded to his heart beginning to crack. He thought about Thomas, driving through this rain in that broken-down taxi, probably picking up another passenger who would dismiss him as irrelevant. He thought about the notebook full of quiet suffering, of faith maintained through loss that would have destroyed lesser men. He thought about his father, and for the first time since the funeral, he let himself really grieve. The sobs came from somewhere deep and long buried. They shook his shoulders and blurred his vision and knocked him to his knees on the expensive hardwood floor. He cried for his father, who'd died alone while his son chased money. He cried for Thomas, who'd lost everything and still chose kindness. He cried for all the people he'd hurt in his climb to the top, for all the Jenkins he'd fired without thought, for all the service people he'd dismissed as beneath him. He cried until the tears ran dry, and then he sat in the darkness of his penthouse and made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would start the hard work of becoming someone better. He would learn the doorman's name. He would notice the concierge's smile. He would look at the people who made his comfortable life possible and see them as human beings worthy of respect. It wouldn't be easy. It would mean unlearning years of cruelty dressed up as ambition. It would mean facing the truth about who he'd become and actively choosing to be different. But if Thomas could choose forgiveness every day after losing everything, surely Damien could choose kindness from a position of privilege and plenty. The rain continued, washing the city clean, and in his expensive tower, a man who'd thought he had everything began the slow work of gaining the only thing that truly mattered: a soul worth having. 3 months later, Thomas picked up a passenger outside the same Grandmark hotel. Another young professional, another expensive suit, another phone pressed to his ear. Thomas prepared himself for the familiar mockery, but the passenger surprised him. "Excuse me," the man said, ending his call before getting in. "I'm heading to 5th and Madison. Is that on your route?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Great. And I apologize in advance if I seem distracted. Long day." They drove in comfortable silence until they hit traffic. The passenger, instead of complaining, simply looked out the window. When they passed a homeless veteran on the corner, the young man asked Thomas to pull over. "One moment," he said, stepping out. Thomas watched in the rearview mirror as the passenger knelt beside the veteran, speaking to him with genuine interest, not just depositing money and fleeing. When he returned to the taxi, his eyes were thoughtful. "You know," the passenger said as they continued driving, "I used to be an absolute nightmare, treated people like they were beneath me, but someone taught me that every person has a story worth hearing. Changed my whole life." "Sounds like a wise teacher," Thomas said. "The wisest. Taxi driver, actually. Met him a few months ago. He'd lost everything but kept his humanity intact. I've been trying to do the same ever since." They arrived at 5th and Madison. The young man paid the fare, added a generous but not insulting tip, and before leaving, said something that made Thomas's eyes sting with sudden tears. "I learned the doorman's name at my building. His name is Robert. He has 3 kids, and he's working 2 jobs to put them through school. I never knew that before, never even thought to ask. But I asked, and you know what? It turns out people are a lot more interesting when you actually see them as people." Thomas nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. "Thank you for the ride," the passenger said. "And thank you for existing. Someone needed me to meet you tonight. I needed to remember." After he left, Thomas sat at the curb for a moment, letting the tears come. They weren't tears of grief this time, but of something else, something that felt like hope. He touched the wooden cross hanging from his mirror, and for the first time in 12 years, his prayer of thanks felt like it was being heard by someone who truly cared. The city continued around him, full of people fighting battles he'd never know about, each one precious, each one worthy, each one carrying their own stories of loss and hope and the daily choice to keep going. And Thomas, in his battered taxi with his aching hands and his heart full of hard-won wisdom, pulled back into traffic to meet the next person who needed a ride. Not everyone would see him, not everyone would treat him with respect. But some would, and some was enough. Some was always enough. The meter clicked over to the next fare, and Thomas Kepler drove on through the rainy streets, a man who'd lost everything except the only thing that truly mattered, the ability to love people anyway. 7 months after that night, an envelope arrived at the taxi depot addressed to Thomas Kepler. Inside was a letter written in careful handwriting that Thomas recognized instantly. "Mr. Kepler, I hope this letter finds you well. You won't remember me by name, but 7 months ago you drove me from the Grandmark Hotel to my building on 5th and Madison. I was the arrogant passenger who mocked you, who treated you as less than human, who read your private notebook and had my entire worldview shattered in 20 minutes. I think about that night constantly. You told me it's never too late to change, and I've been testing that theory every day since. I wanted you to know that I quit my job 3 months ago. Not because I failed, but because I realized I'd been succeeding at the wrong things. I'm working now at a non-profit that helps families navigate medical debt, the kind of debt that destroys lives like it destroyed yours. I'll never make $40 million doing this work. I'll never have a corner office or a penthouse view, but I'll go to sleep at night knowing I helped someone, and I'm starting to understand that this might be what success actually looks like. I learned the names of everyone in my building. I volunteer at the hospice where my father died. I visit his grave every Sunday and tell him I finally understand what he was trying to teach me. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to seek validation. You gave me both of those things already, far more than I deserved. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that your kindness saved my life. Not in a dramatic physical sense, but in the way that matters most. You saved me from becoming a person I would have hated. There's a check enclosed with this letter. It's not guilt money or charity. It's a gift from someone whose life you changed, who wants to help you in some small way, the way you helped me, in every possible way. If you choose not to cash it, I'll understand. But please know it comes with genuine gratitude and respect. You once told me that every person is fighting a battle I know nothing about. I carry that wisdom with me everywhere now. I try to see people the way you saw me that night, not as who they are in their worst moment, but as who they might become if shown grace instead of judgment. Thank you, Mr. Kepler. Thank you for being the kind of person who chooses kindness when life gives you every reason to choose bitterness. Thank you for showing me what actual strength looks like. Your faith inspired mine. Your example saved me. With deepest gratitude, Damian Whitmore Thomas read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his weathered face. The check was generous, enough to replace his taxi with something more reliable, maybe even take a vacation for the first time in 12 years. But the real gift was the letter itself, the knowledge that his suffering hadn't been meaningless, that his choice to maintain grace under fire had planted a seed that had grown into something beautiful, that Miriam, wherever she was, could be proud of the man he'd remained, despite everything life had taken from him. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his notebook on the page after his last entry. Then he picked up his pen and wrote, Day 3300. Received a letter today from the young man who mocked me months ago. He's changed, really changed. Sometimes I wonder if any of this matters, if my small acts of kindness make any difference in a world this hard. Today, I have my answer. They do. They matter more than I can possibly measure. Miriam would be proud. I'm proud. Thank you for this reminder that grace is never wasted, even when it feels like seeds thrown on stone. Some seeds take time to grow, but when they do, the harvest is worth every tear planted in faith. He closed the notebook, touched the wooden cross hanging from his mirror, and started his taxi. There were people who needed rides, and he had work to do. Honest work, meaningful work, work that mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage or corner offices, but in changed hearts and transformed lives and the quiet dignity of treating every person as infinitely valuable. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. And Thomas Kepler, who'd lost everything except his humanity, drove out into a city full of people fighting battles he knew nothing about, ready to offer kindness to whoever needed a ride, because in the end, that's what any of us can do. Show up, be present, treat people with grace, and trust that small acts of compassion ripple outward in ways we may never see, but that change the world nonetheless. The cross swung gently from the mirror, catching the morning light. And somewhere, in a city full of people learning to see each other, a young man named Damian Whitmore walked into a hospice center, ready to sit with dying patients who had no family, ready to hold their hands and tell them they mattered, ready to offer the kind of presence that had once been offered to his father, but that he'd been too blind to give. All because a taxi driver named Thomas Kepler had chosen grace when cruelty would have been so much easier. The meter clicked forward. The journey continued, and love, in its quiet, persistent way, kept changing hearts one broken person at a time.